Hello, my name's Dyfed. Today I'm going to talk about how surveillance and research outputs from basic to more complex linked cancer data can lead to a better understanding of cancer epidemiology, risk factors, health services and outcomes for cancer patients. So in this webinar, I'm going to start with the basics of cancer epidemiology, take you through what cancer registry data can do with some extra data linkage, go back to the beginning about what the key features of whole population-based cancer registries are, and then, intriguingly perhaps, I'm going to talk about capturing again, and close with trusted research environments, and this is the bit about big data and what we can do now and in the future. So starting with the whole population mortality data, we receive this at the Welsh Cancer Intelligence and Surveillance Unit at Public Health Wales from ONS, and I'll explain later what exactly we do with it in terms of processing, but this is what we do in terms of analysis. Using whole population mortality data is a good place to start in an attempt to estimate the true epidemiology of any health condition. And here you can see that the European age standardized rate for mortality for lung cancer is the highest of all the main cancers in Wales. We produce this statistic on a statutory basis each year using all the data we receive on mortality from ONS. Cancer mortality is a recognised overall measure of the success of cancer control in any country, and WHO uses it for comparing cancer control. You'll see that in Wales, lung cancer accounts for more deaths each year than colorectal, breast and liver cancers combined. So us public health physicians are generally quite interested in inequalities and preferably doing something about them. So, and perhaps of all the cancers, it's no surprise that lung cancer has some of the widest inequalities of all of them, particularly when it comes to mortality rates. And here we've attached the mortality data to geographic data on lower super output areas and the quintiles of Welsh index and multiple deprivation in which they fall. And you can see that the most deprived quintile has this mortality rate here, and this is the mortality rate of the least deprived quintile in Wales. So this rate is about 3 times that in the most affluent areas, with about half as many deaths, admittedly. And one of the key things we've noticed is that the mortality has hardly changed in the most deprived areas of Wales, and it's been slowly decreasing in the least deprived areas. We know that this has contributed to the observed decrease in life expectancy in Wales and the UK countries, along with the US, whilst life expectancy had stalled in most high-income countries, as some of you may know. And mortality is a function of the incidence and the survival rate, which we'll come to in just a while. So So I've established some credentials and useful mortality data, but it doesn't go anywhere near explaining the whole epidemiology of any health condition. But it's very hard to come by population incidence data on a routine basis, which is why mortality is used at national and international levels to compare burdens of health and burdens of disease. Fortunately, in the world of cancer, there is a long history and tradition of population-based cancer registration, which is quite a laborious process, which we'll get into later, but it does provide us with very good incidence data. And here is that in use. So every year, WCISU produces official statistics for incidence, mortality and survival, actually. And they have a statutory basis as well. It's one of the statutory functions of Public Health Wales. And we use the registrations to do this. And here you have the European age standardised rates for men and women for lung cancer in Wales. These are actually the latest available to 2017, but on the 25th of March, we will be publishing our 2018 incidence data. And I'll come to why there's such a lag later in the talk. And you can see that overall, all persons incidence is almost flatlining now in Wales. That's because whilst men have for a long time had an incidence that's sharply declining, that in women has been increasing and increasing, particularly in older women. Although you can see now that that is beginning to taper off. For every case of cancer we record in the population, we're able to increasingly hold more and more detail, which again I'll talk about later. But we are getting better and better at recording quite complex staging at diagnosis in particular. And this slide, which is slightly out of date, as I said, there'll be more recent data on the website now and soon. This slide sadly confirms what we know at the clinical level, that most people with lung cancer are diagnosed at a late stage. That said, there is quite a significant minority that are diagnosed at stage 1 and 2, so let's not forget that. And here you can see the variation between the health boards, which is not insignificant. If we look at potentially treatable stages 1 and 2. Powys is always a bit of an anomaly. You'll see there's quite a lot of unknown stage here. That's a historic thing that'll fizzle out when we get beyond 2016 data, as we've changed our processes since then, and many of Powys's patients will have gone across border. And again, I'll explain that later. But whichever way we've looked at it, we've noticed that in the Swansea area, we'll have newer health boards as well, Cwm Taf Morgannwg and Swansea Bay in the next iteration. You can see that is persistently low compared to some of the other areas in Wales as a whole. So, talked about mortality data. I've talked about incidence data from Cancer Registry database itself. In fact, without me realizing it, I've already talked about some basic data linkage in the data files on local index of multiple deprivation, which has to be linked. And if we link mortality data to Cancer Registry data, which we do, we can, through quite complex statistical methods that do vary, there's various ways of doing it at the population level, we can produce cancer survival. And there's a couple of methods that we use at the population level. This isn't the same as the sort of Kaplan-Meier survival curves you might use in research or even at the clinical level. We use life table methods to take into account the mortality, the background mortality of different age groups that they would experience anyway, whether or not they would develop cancer like they have in our registry. So here we have the net lung cancer survival at the population level. This is unstandardized for age. When we have bigger numbers, we standardize for age as well, which allows better comparison for obvious reasons. But this may seem obvious, but this does re-emphasize what I was alluding to earlier, in that lung cancer is actually survivable if caught early. If we look at stages 1 and 2 there, and this is whole population. However, because of the tendency for late diagnosis, the overall survival for all stages combined is just over 1/3, but that is better than it used to be. And again, we will come on to that. Now, back to inequalities again. This is using our official statistics. You'll find all of this and more on other cancers on our website, indicated here, and that's where you'll find our latest incidence dashboard, which you can pick and choose various parameters that you care to look at for the 25th of March incidence. And then before the summer, we should get the latest available population survival. No, what am I doing? It's mortality. So mortality based on the latest available whole year data will be out before the summer, and early in autumn we should get then an update of the survival, this kind of data for all sorts of cancers. We've been particularly delayed this year because quite a few of our staff have been redeployed to COVID-19 epidemiology, the charts that you see every day on the news. So we're struggling a bit, but I'm sure we'll catch up. Right. Let's see this laser pointer, getting used to this and this webinar. It's actually quite a strange experience. Yes, so we've got cancer survival in lung cancer survival, 5-year this time. So obviously it's quite a bit less than the 1-year survival, lung cancer being fairly lethal, unfortunately. And then we're getting to around a 10% survival in the lowest deprivation score areas, the quintile, and almost 16% then in the most affluent areas. Of course, most cases of cancer, certainly the highest rate, is here, but nevertheless, especially amongst older women and older men, there's still quite a bit in the most affluent areas. And you'll see how since over a decade ago, the most affluent areas have had the fastest growing survival. Now, if this is not an example of the inverse care law, I don't know what is. But it's 50% higher survival in the most affluent areas compared to the least deprived, the most deprived areas. And the absolute difference is quite sizable considering the size of lung cancer survival in general. So WCISU is and has been involved in 2 or 3 ongoing international survival studies. The Concord series of studies is a programme run by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And we collaborate with Professor Michelle Coleman and his team on a regular basis on this. This is our latest work from that study. I think we're moving to Concord 4 now. There's a bit of a time lag by the time you get the data in from all the countries, but one of the key points is that mortality data And cancer registration data is whole population, as I said, but it's also done according to international standards and rules. So it is fairly comparable between countries, and so we can compile epidemiology like this for survival, not just mortality, which obviously includes incident data. And what this shows us, and I could have chosen a number of cancers from this global study. I've picked out more high income and European countries combined with other high income countries, is the low survival in the UK countries, not just Wales. You'll see the hang on, where's the pointer? You'll see the confidence intervals are quite wide here. So I think it's, they're within the same order of magnitude. England has probably got significantly higher survival than Wales, but the difference isn't large. But you do see the range here, and Canada, Austria, and Australia seem to come out well for many of the cancers that we studied. Now, we also take part in the International Cancer Benchmarking Partnership. This is more high-income countries with similar health systems, generally universally available, broadly free at the point of care, so which is why you don't see the United States taking part, for example. And as I said, the Concord series of studies is global, and we do actually have to model estimates for some of the lower income countries in terms of cancer registration in order to get some global figures on 70 countries around the world. So you could argue this is more like comparing apples with apples, given the standards of the cancer registries as well, which are very high. Phase 1 has been, and we've taken part in many of these studies, some but not all of them, including cancer registry data. We're into phase 2 now. We're talking about a phase 3, where we looked at the effect of comorbidities in terms of survival differences in phase 1. And it's a tricky one to measure internationally, the difference between comorbidities, and the length of hospital stay in the preceding year to diagnosis seemed to be the better indicator of that. We're looking now into the effect of various parameters in cancer patient pathways, and we've got a paper coming out soon that looks at cancer survival across the jurisdictions you see here, and the routes to diagnosis. Broadly speaking, were patients admitted at the time of diagnosis as emergencies or as urgent suspected cancer cases. So watch out for that soon. Anyway, we already have the results from a Lancet Oncology publication in 2019, which largely repeated the basic epidemiology of incidence and survival over a decade ago. So let's find that. And part of the title of my study is what has all this led to. Well, it's led to some of this. Right. Okay, so similar to the Concord study, this recent ICBP SERVMARK2 study has shown how low lung cancer survival was in the UK jurisdictions, as you can see here. Many of the other countries, jurisdictions, especially in Canada and Australia, were way ahead early on during this period, although they were less advanced in some of these countries here. Now, in the latest diagnosis period, you can see that the UK countries have made significant advances. So this is 1 year survival, as you can see. So there's quite a few percentage point increases there in survival, which is why I said from our official statistics how lung cancer survival used to be very poor. So it is worthwhile making efforts to improve survival. What has happened in the meantime, though, is the countries already with high lung cancer survival have advanced to the same degree in general. So it shows you, for example, Western Australia, about 50%, and New Brunswick in Canada, they've all made good advances on the whole. About 50% survival is possible with early lung cancer, I imagine. So that is a worthwhile endeavour. So from your armchair on a late Friday afternoon, I hope you can agree with me that even the basic epidemiology at international level, with some linkage, and depending how the descriptive data is demonstrated, can actually tell us quite a lot about what is going on, certainly with lung cancer as my example. A bit more linkage can shed even further light on the matter. So this is some work we did supported by Macmillan, and it involved linkage to PEDU, the hospital administrative data, to derive recognised comorbidity score, the Charlson score. We also used the area deprivation boundaries, GP cluster boundaries I mentioned before, and the ONS rural-urban classification digital file for those boundaries. Let me just break this down for you. What this shows is for Wales, for lung cancer, again, just as an example, you can go to our website and look at other cancers. We've got here age bands, we've got here area deprivation, rural, urban, sex, and cancer stage diagnosis. And what this shows is the proportion and the number of cases in each that had a Charlson score of 0. None of the comorbidities that fit in to the definitions of the Charlson score. This colour is at least one of them, and then this is 2 or more. And there's actually not that much variation for those with 1 or 2 or more by area deprivation, which might be counterintuitive. There's certainly slightly less for the least deprived, but the gradient isn't that steep. Not much with rural and urban. Women, lung cancer patients have slightly less, and perhaps counterintuitively, I thought anyway, for late stage, the proportion with these comorbidities is less. So there's some work to understand this, but my hunch is that those in early stage perhaps had an earlier index of suspicion, might have had lots of chest x-rays because of COPD, and so were picked up earlier. So there's something counterintuitive going on here that needs a bit more explanation. However, the largest gradient, and unsurprisingly, was age. You saw a lot of comorbidities in the older age group compared to the younger age group, as would be imagined, but still quite a lot at the under 50s with lung cancer. So there's a whole system of collecting death data, starting with death certificates, as we all know, which allows us to use mortality data with some confidence at on a routine basis and at the population level. But population incidence of cancer doesn't just fall out of thin air, and there's no one data source, routine data source that would be good enough for a whole population. So this slide shows you what some of the features are of a whole population-based cancer registry, and at WCISW in Public Health Wales, that's one of our core statutory functions, which is to compile such a registry. So we're aiming to register all the cases of cancer that occur in the residence population each year, because we're epidemiologists. The definition of resident population is important. We have a denominator. It's systematic, that's my job. And we exist as a statutory basis, and we do it every year in an organised fashion. We have regular funding, I have, of course, staff. The legal basis is both in terms of we have the legal authority to do it. It's a statutory function of Public Health Wales. And because we are taking patient data that's fully identifiable under strict confidentiality law, of course, so it falls under the Data Protection Act. But in order to take that data carefully, but without individual consent of each patient, which would be impractical, we process about 250,000 pieces of data each year and end up with about 19,000 tumour cases each year. That would just be impracticable and wouldn't be possible. So we do that under Section 251 approval of the confidentiality advisory group of the Health Research Authority. Arguably, we don't necessarily need this because of the legal basis of the statutory function of doing this by Public Health Wales, but that's a separate legal discussion. Multiple sources of data are used to make sure we capture every case, and also that we get as much detail as possible from a defined minimum data set for the registry for each case. And for coding, classification and staging, we follow international rules to derive them. And as long as data sources and legislation allows, we then follow the rules set out by WHO, International Association of Cancer Registries, European Network of Cancer Registries, which filters down to us through the UK and Ireland Association of Cancer Registries. And it takes quite a lot of training and highly trained staff to be able to do this, along with computer algorithms and sophisticated IT to sustain this process and ensure strict information governance. And this, one of the key things which you've seen in terms of the international capabilities of registration is that it's comparable because we follow those same rules and we aim for completeness. And we've got various data quality checks and the procedures, the multiple data sources and the rules we follow and the data capture ensure the validity of the data. So it's a goldmine, really. It's an incredible resource, and we don't see this in many other health conditions. You can see the quality of our data at the UK ICR website. We peer review, and that's something that I'm doing after recording this webinar for the latest 2018 data. Here's another slide that I'll leave you go through over the weekend, comparing the difference between our population-based registry approach and various clinical pathology-based or hospital-based registries. Depending on the catchment area of some of these, they may approximate to each other, and increasingly that's the case. So I should have mentioned the timeliness aspect. Now, one of the drawbacks of high quality cancer registries is that it takes quite a bit of time to bring all that together, curate it, and validate it. So there's always a bit of a lag before the whole annual year data set is available. So for a rapidly changing situation, it's not ideal, but it is good for the ongoing cancer surveillance that I have shown you. We have taken, one of our data sources is a pathology feed of histopathology and cytology via NWIS of the Welsh limbs. And we wanted to see if we could pick up a signal about what has happened to pathology samples of patients who are presenting with cancer in Wales last year compared to this 2020, the pandemic year. This is the pandemic. These are the weeks of 2020 and 2019. And these are the number of samples each week that are coming back showing cancer. Now, this is some of the raw data we get for cancer registration. This isn't incident cases. These are primary tumours, secondary tumours, multiple biopsies from the same tumour. They may be recurrences and metastases and so on. But it does give you an indication of what's going on. And as you can see, this came down before the lockdown in March, improved a bit, didn't fully recover, and has come down since then towards the end of November. We're going to continue surveillance here because the data is available each month to us, and it is feeding into the cancer network, trying to see what's happening with services. Right then, you need to take a deep breath now and sit forward and pay attention, as do I. If I was only meant to show one slide for this talk, this would be it. And what it's showing is the cancer data environment across Wales and across border into England. Part of that reason is that along the border in mid and north Wales, a certain percentage of cancer patients will travel across that border on a routine basis for common cancers and certainly for rarer cancers. So it's important for a whole population that we capture that data on the Welsh residents. So in order to simplify this mainly for my benefit, I'll start over here in Wales. If you think of these are the raw routine data sources that come from clinical systems, from vital statistics, such as the cancer deaths from ONS. In Wales, it differs from England. Many of these come already grouped up into a national data set, not directly to us via health boards. So we have the Welsh limbs. We've just seen those pathology reports. That's one of our major sources of identifying cancer cases and getting information on stage and morphology. We've got a much better extract of data on cases, basis of diagnosis, stage of diagnosis, various other investigations from CANISC. We also get any mention of cancer in patients from PEDU, the hospital administration system. We often actually have to get into radiology reports and pathology reports text to establish the details for cancer registration, which isn't ideal, and natural language processing and machine learning may be helpful for us, especially with the advent of SNOMED CT in the future, or if anybody would like to volunteer to persuade any radiologists out there or pathologists to codify their reports even more that would be really helpful for secondary uses. Within Public Health Wales, we also get screening data. The screening division sits alongside us. And we now get the radiotherapy treatment data, RTDS, from centres in Wales and centres in England who are treating Welsh patients. This will be going back into NWIS soon. My team are on a training course this week. We're about to receive, for 2020 registrations, routine NHS cancer genetic data and molecular data for each case where this is taken. So I think this will be fairly important for cancers such as lung and breast, obviously. And the 3 cancer centres in Wales are under discussion with us about us receiving SACT data. We're already getting SACT data on Welsh patients seen in England through our joint system with the English Cancer Registry. But this may actually go straight to NWIS in future, and we'll receive it via NWIS. So we share an IT and informatics platform with PHE due to quite significant cross-border activity. And their bit is called Encore, and our bit is called Catrin. We can't see their postcode data, they can't see ours. And the French speakers amongst you will understand why I've labelled this section of the talk as Catrin again. Much of this data sits in our part of the cancer registration system, and going back to those coding rules that I talked about, we compile each case of cancer as the data comes through. There's some automatic registration of the coded data, and then we build on that with other algorithms and with the work of the cancer registration officers. As you can see, we can use some of the data sets real time, such as the pathology. And each year when we complete the cancer registration database itself, NWIS are getting a copy into the NHS National Data Resource, which is going to be the use of secondary data for NHS purposes in a trusted research environment there. Sale Data Bank also gets a copy of that for research purposes. And increasingly, particularly with the COVID pandemic, much of the individual data sets have been going into Sale on an almost real-time basis, which will allow for more complex analysis. You'll see many of these data sets are potentially available, are already available in Sale or with us, and increasingly in both. And they will also be available in NWIS's NDR. So Wikisu is developing an emerging research collaboration with colleagues at the Cell Data Bank, which comes under the umbrella of HDR UK, and the DataCan collaboration underneath that. One of the advantages of SAIL is the huge amount of different healthcare and non-healthcare data in there, and the fact that you can link it to each other and to bespoke data sets. For example, some of you may wish to import clinical trial data and other research data sets that you may have, survey data perhaps, and can link that to various data in there. NWIS encrypt this, and it's still linkable within the research environment. So these are some of the core data sets, our own included, but there are many more routine data sets in there. And as I said, you can import bespoke data set. The COVID pandemic has meant that we've been able to increase the timeliness and the range of cancer data within SAIL, and we hope this will be able to last. There's no reason not to. And some of the work that we are doing now is looking at understanding that pathology COVID data a bit more, and looking at what effect the pandemic has had on stage shift, the sort of cancer patients that have presented and those that haven't, what is going to happen in the near future, the next few years, how this needs to lead to perhaps service model change, and also in the short term, how have cancer patients been presenting to the health system. We already know that, for example, with lung cancer patients, about half present as emergencies, but has that increased or decreased? We know that screening services stopped, for example, for a long time. And how has this affected patients with other cancers? So you can begin to see how this range of routine data can be timely, it can be high quality with some lag, and there is a vast range there that's on the whole potentially untapped, especially if you think we can link this to more detailed research data as well. So the whole population data in SAIL of various sources allows for real-world research. Cohorts can be defined of cancer or non-cancer patients, and they can be followed up retrospectively or prospectively. You can link trial and other research data, such as surveys, to routine data or to some of these cohorts. For example, some of the work that we're involved in is looking at what the outcomes have been of therapies of drugs after they have gone through clinical trials and their application in the real world. Did they turn out to do what they showed they could do in clinical trials, for example? And there are a whole range of etiological risk factor and health service studies that can be done in the SAIL environment. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you've found it interesting and that you've learned a bit about epidemiology, particularly of lung cancer, the intricacies and complexities of cancer registration and the cancer data environment in Wales, but also how there's so much untapped insight, research and knowledge within the vast gold mine of cancer data and linkable cancer data that we have in Wales, which is actually fairly unique. There's almost nowhere in the world that has this range of real health service, whole population, cancer and non-cancer health data available for research and health service purposes. So hopefully you can make the most of that in the future, either with us or directly with your own data in SAIL and working with us at the Cancer Registry. Have a good weekend and thank you for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn.